Hey everyone. This time we are going to be talking about my 5 favorite Atari 2600 games so far. So these are just the games that I've played so far. There are still more to go, so I might update this at some point. The first one up is Galaxian. This is a really good port of Galaxian. I still would prefer the home port or the arcade, but for a home port of this time, this is pretty good. It gets across what you need it to get across. It's just a single screen space shooter, but I think this one is really well done. I also think this port is much better than the Atari 2600's port of Space Invaders. I also just like Galaxian and Galaga more than I like Space Invaders, so this was probably going to be one of my favorite games anyway, and it's a lot better than their Space Invaders port. Next we have Berserk. This is pretty awesome. I really like just the way that you can move your character around. I think the sprites look pretty good for the time, and yeah, it's just a fun game to run around in and do your best to not die, all the while making these stupid robots almost kill themselves and sometimes shoot themselves, run into walls, that sort of thing. It's a pretty competent port, and it handles well. Everything's really good in this game. The only thing that I don't like, and it's not even like a huge problem, I just don't like the fact that when you bounce into the walls you die. Now let's get into some of the horror games. This is Haunted House, and yeah, it's actually really fun to run around in and try to just find your way out. This is a surprisingly good game that wasn't based on an arcade port, so you don't have to really deal with a lot of the weird stuff that was going on. They could kind of just make their own game. They didn't have to worry about staying true to what the arcades were, and it's a pretty fun original game. I like that you're just a pair of eyeballs. It seems to work pretty well. Surprisingly, the animation of your eyes looking in the direction that you're going works great, and I like the little match that you light up. So let's stick with horror, and we'll move on to Frankensteins Monster. This is probably the most visually impressive game that I've seen on the Atari 2600. There is a lot going on. There's a lot of colors on here. The animation of your weird dude that I don't really know who he's supposed to be, but his animation's pretty good. The jumping is not great in this. It's kind of crap. And that wouldn't be such a huge problem if it wasn't for the fact that you really need to jump in this game. It's sort of the whole point of it. You need to grab the little brick, run it back up to the top level, and build a wall to try to keep Frankenstein's monster in place. Over time, Frankenstein's monster gets more and more green, and when he gets completely green, then he comes to life and the game's over. There's not really too much more to say about that, so let's move on to my favorite game on the Atari 2600. This is Missile Command. This one is really good. Now, granted, I still think the arcade version is better, but you could say that about a lot of home ports. Missile Command is probably my favorite game on the Atari 2600. I don't really see that changing, to be honest with you. I've read an awful lot about Missile Command over the years, from doing book reviews and also from just kind of playing the different ports of Missile Command. It's a lot of fun to play. There's a lot of strategy that goes into this game, and I think the Atari 2600 port was very competently made. Working within the different restrictions that they had, where you didn't have really the ability to kind of get everything that the arcade port had. You couldn't get all the missile launchers. You had to work with the restrictions of only having one button and a joystick. I think they did a very good job with this port. It's not perfect, but it's still very well done. So let's go ahead and wrap this whole thing up, and I'll give you a few of my final thoughts on the whole, Atari 2600 games that I've played so far. When I started playing these, I didn't really know what to expect. I had played a few games way, way back in the day. I think the first Atari 2600 game I ever played was Pac-Man, and everybody kind of knows about that port by now. So I didn't really have a huge baseline for Atari 2600 games. I knew a lot of them were going to be single-screen arcade experiences, and they weren't going to be as good as the arcade ports or the arcade games because they just couldn't be. The system didn't have the power to match the arcades at the time, and there were a lot of other restrictions. But I think these 5 games really kind of stood out to me out of all the other ones that I played. You also have a few original ones on there, like Haunted House and Frankensteins Monster, which didn't have to worry about, being truthful to an arcade port. They could just kind of be their own thing. They could do whatever they needed to do, and nobody had to worry about saying, oh, this wasn't, the same. This wasn't like the arcade version of it. That works both to their advantage and to their disadvantage. It goes back to the idea of having like intellectual property and people not recognizing it right away. A lot of these Atari 2600 games got bought up because people played the arcade game and then they would want to play that same thing at home, and obviously they couldn't afford, an arcade cabinet, so they bought the system. Stuff like Haunted House and Frankensteins Monster didn't have that visibility that some of these others did. And that's kind of why I think they're a little bit more special than the other games. Also, Adventure is another one, but I haven't played that for the channel yet. So that's going to wrap things up, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.